The War of the Roses Part 8. How the War of the Roses ended as a result of the confrontation. Neither the Lancasters nor the Yorks were able to firmly establish themselves on the throne. The dynasty of the former was cut short after the death of Henry VI, and the policies of Richard III effectively put an end to the prospects of the latter. Most of the aristocracy, disappointed in both, eventually turned their gaze to Henry Tudor. The lack of legitimacy of the pretender did not prevent this. The marriage of Henry Tudor and Elizabeth of York can be called the end of the War of the Roses. The unification of the dynasties strengthened the legitimacy of the new king and put an end to the confrontation between the Yorks and the Lancasters and their related houses. Who was the victor? The main beneficiary of the confrontation, of course, was Henry Tudor. The dynasty had effectively remained in the shadows until the end of the war, supporting the Lancasters, but not claiming a leading role in the dispute with the Yorks. In many ways, Henry was lucky. The death of the heirs of Edward IV and the controversial policies of Richard III make him the most preferred candidate for the English throne in the eyes of many aristocrats. The role of Margaret Beaufort, the matriarch of the Tudor dynasty, who initiated Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, was also undoubtedly crucial. The first years of the king's reign were marked by rebellions of impostors who called themselves descendants of the Yorks and sought to seize the throne by force. Influential feudal lords often stood behind them. Such rebellions were the uprisings of Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck. They were quite quickly defeated. The captured impostors were kept in good conditions. In general, a distinctive feature of Henry VII's reign was a benevolent attitude towards his potential rivals. Henry strengthened England's shaky international position through advantageous dynastic marriages. In particular, thanks to the marriage of his daughter Margaret to the King of Scotland, James IV, the English monarch secured the northern borders. In the long term, this event allowed the Scottish Stuarts to claim the English throne a century later. The consequences of the dynastic conflict for England, in addition to the fall of one dynasty, the Lancasters, and the rise of a new one, the Tudors, the war had important consequences. Fearing a recurrence of the conflict in one form or another, the kings subsequently deprived the major aristocrats of the right to maintain their own armies. The monopoly on violence was almost entirely transferred to the state. The Tudors became the first English monarchs to embark on the path of absolutism. Changes began to occur already during the reign of Richard III. He supported a policy of protectionism, made an attempt to streamline the judicial system and tax collection. His initiatives were continued by the Tudors. Henry V, on the one hand, strengthened control over the already depleted aristocracy, and on the other, patronized trade and merchants, providing, if necessary, significant subsidies for their activities. Thanks to this, the country was able to quickly improve its internal situation. Almost a quarter of a century of the rule of the first Tudor became a time of peace and tranquility. It is believed that it is the Wars of the Roses that mark the starting point for the modern age in the history of England. The myths of the Wars of the Roses, almost the entire history of the conflict, is to some extent associated with myth-making, which began during the war itself. Because of this, the reliability of some events is still in question. Immediately after his accession to the throne, Henry V began to form his own version of events, in which the role of the main antagonist was played by Richard III, a child murderer and sadist, while other participants in the conflict were described relatively neutrally. This was done, on the one hand, to reconcile the supporters of the Yorkists and the Lancastrians, and on the other, to give greater legitimacy to Henry V himself, who had overthrown Richard. However, towards the end of the king's reign, criticism fell on the Yorkists, despite the fact that the monarch's wife belonged to this dynasty. In the era of Henry VIII's reign, accusations were directed at the wife of Henry VI, Margaret of Anjou. In addition, the image of Richard III was expanded, thanks to the work of Thomas More, dedicated to the last Yorkist on the throne. In the era of Elizabeth I, a major role in the next transformation of the myth of the Wars of the Roses was played by William Shakespeare, who created a series of historical chronicles. In particular, it was his pen that wrote the famous scene in which the Lancastrians and Yorkists in the garden of the Tower of London choose the colours of roses as symbols of the struggle. In reality, this event did not take place, but it has become part of the mythology of the Wars of the Roses. The era of bloody tragedy described by Shakespeare has firmly entered the historical consciousness of England. The famous Walter Scott also lent a hand to its creation. It was he who introduced the term War of the Red and White Rose into widespread use. Currently, thanks to the research of historians, the myths are gradually being debunked, but there are still many white spots. If you enjoy our videos, please subscribe to the channel, like, and leave a comment if you'd like.